Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We will give everyone some time to dial in, so I'll just keep the tension up a bit longer before we kick us off with the intro and then the exciting content you're here for. So we'll just wait a bit for people to dial in. In the meantime, I would love to hear who you are and where you're from. So I just see here Hannah has already said hello. You can use the chat to just quickly say, hi, I'm dialing in from London, from Stockholm, where for example. Would love to hear a bit from where you are. And if you want, you can add your organization, your institution as a reference, just to get a bit of an idea of who's on the other side. Because otherwise we never see you. We only have the chat. So while more people are joining, we'll just use some time for intro. So we have Oxford here, that's great. We have London. Let's see who else we have here. Good. There's still some people joining, so I'll just wait for a few more seconds. And then Nottingham, Bristol. Good. Okay. It's 2 parts now. I don't want to be impolite with those who are on point. After all, I still have a lot of German in me, so I do want to be roughly on time. So excited for this webinar here and excited to have you all with us. So today's webinar is on climate solutions, the role of policy and regulation in scaling solutions for a low carbon world. And this is a topic that is top of mind for a lot of organizations, a lot of policymakers, obviously. And now we're moving into the biggest, admittedly most important climate conference of the year, the UN COP29, kicking off in just a few days next week. So there's going to be also a lot of talk around policy, obviously. Today, it's not going to be up to me. So I'm Alex. I'm Head of Science, Sustainability, and Climate Research at Normative. But it's going to be for our panel to speak to these topics. I'm really, really happy to have such a broad representation here across the ecosystem of research and also practitioners. So I would love to welcome Eva, Ella, and Claire. And I thought it might be best if each of them just quickly says hi themselves and just give a quick intro, because I won't do it justice. So Eva, why don't you quickly tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Ebba Mark. I am a DPhil student and researcher at Climate Econometrics, which is part of the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the University of Oxford.
Perfect. I love econometrics. That's my background as well. So finally, someone to bond over with. So Ella, up to you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Ella Sexton. I've been working on climate for probably the best part of a decade now, and I currently lead on climate strategy implementation at IIGCC, the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, which is a network of investors working towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. And as part of this, I lead on climate solutions, so very excited to be here to discuss this.
Amazing. And we're excited to have you with us and to hear your input. Same as for Claire. Claire, who are you and what is your background?
Yes, thank you. So I'm currently the head of climate performance practice at the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. And we're a collaborative climate initiative working with about 30 large corporates, global corporates, and helping them to increase the ambition of their climate work. We do that with them individually and collaboratively in groups working on concepts and guides and tools, for instance, on climate solutions.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Claire. And I know you have your hands, your brain, also your thoughts into a lot of different initiatives and forums as well. So really happy to have you speak to those today. So with this, first of all, thank you, Eva, Ella, and Claire. We're going to hear from you again very soon. Let me just quickly go over a few admin items for everyone here on the call, just that you are roughly aware of what's going to happen. So This webinar is a bit of a mix. We have the first 30 minutes focused on what we just discussed, the content here for climate solutions. And this will be recorded, and you're going to get a copy of the recording, access to the recording after the event. So in case anything is missing or breaking down, you will be able to catch up on everything that we discussed later on. You have already found the chat, which I encourage you to use to share your thoughts, your feedback, what have you. We also have a questions tab where you can submit questions for the panel. So please channel all your questions in that questions tab, because this way we can more easily sift through them afterwards and don't have to look at all the different comments here in the channel, in the main chat. So use the questions tab, please, for your questions. And there's also going to be polls. So there's the poll tab on the bottom right. So or there might be, when we prompt you for a poll, then you find the poll over there. So you can just respond there. So just to navigate around a bit in this platform, since it might be new for you. There's also going to be a post-webinar survey. It's really, really important for us to hear your feedback. So please stick around just a few seconds after the webinar ends, so you can actually give us the feedback we need to improve in the future. And last but not least, and very importantly, the second half of this webinar is going to be what we call the Doers Club from the Net Zero Policy Network. This is a very exciting new initiative, so we encourage everyone to stick around. This is the more interactive part also of this webinar and of the network itself. So please stick around and hear what we have to share with you for the Doers Club. And we're also going to ask for your feedback and your input. So really excited for this section of this split webinar. With this, enough as an intro from my side. I would love for now the first, I want to give you first a bit of content for the Net Zero Policy Network, just to know kind of who is your quote-unquote host here. So it's a joint collaboration between Normative, where I am from, and Oxford Net Zero, where Kaya is going to join us in a second as well. And this is pretty much right now what we're doing as one of the core pillars of the network, the expert-led webinars. We also have a lot of like peer-to-peer exchange and sharing of best practices and advocacy. And a lot of kind of the platform is engage also with policymakers, which is going to be part of the discussion in the Doers Club in roughly 20 minutes from now. So stick around to also hear what we have in mind moving forward for the network to get you more actively engaged instead of you just being a consumer of news. So it's really exciting stuff we have to share with you in about 20 minutes. So please stick around after the main part of the webinar concludes. Okay, so with this, now I think second try, yes, we're going to go through to the main part of this webinar. And I welcome Eva back on stage to talk to us about some global evidence of the effectiveness of climate policy. So please, Eva, the slides are yours and the stage is also yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Alexander. I'm really excited to be presenting this work, I think in particular to this audience of practitioners, because I think you can probably bring a more realistic perspective to some of this academic research. So this is research that was published in Science just this summer. So it's a collaboration between myself and some of my colleagues at Climate Econometrics, and then some of our colleagues at the Potsdam Institute in Germany. And what we wanted to try to understand is more closely what types of climate mitigation policies have actually been effective in reducing emissions. So we started off with the understanding that there has been a remarkable increase in the number of climate mitigation policies implemented worldwide in just the last 2 decades. And a lot of that is a great thanks to the policy advocacy community here today. However, there's little consensus empirically on what actually works. So how do some of these individual climate mitigation policies work, but also how do they stack up against each other? And so what we wanted to answer was the question of which types of climate mitigation policies have actually had a measurable major impact on reducing emissions. And I'll try to keep the methods discussion short because I imagine that we want to get to the policy insights, but just so that you understand kind of what we were doing here was we took a 2-pronged approach to this question. So the first one was an econometric detection exercise combined with a policy attribution phase. So what we did was we started off with the CO2 emissions data from 41 different countries across 4 sectors in 2 decades and used a a break detection algorithm that's been developed at Climate Econometrics for the past few years to try to understand in which sectors and when countries actually achieved a significant emission reduction beyond what we would be able to explain with more traditional econometric tools. So ones that look at things like population, GDP, and energy use, for example. And with that first step, what we were then able to do was see in each country in which sectors and when have they managed to reduce emissions. So just to sort of give you a flavor of what that means, if you look at Colombia there on the left-hand side, COL, what we're able to say with this econometric exercise is that Colombia succeeded in reducing their emissions once in buildings, twice in electricity, never in industry during the time period that we analyzed, and twice in transport. And so for each country, we were able to see sort of when and where they reduced emissions so that we could then move on to this policy attribution phase. And what we had at our disposal here, which was wonderful, was a recently published database from the OECD called the Climate Actions and Policies Measurement Framework. We believe this to be the most comprehensive climate mitigation policy database that exists to date. During the time period that we analyzed, we had 1,500 climate policies to analyze across these 41 countries within our sample. And just to give you a little flavor of what that policy database looks like, so on the top row, you can see that across each sector, the number of policies that have been implemented in the last 2 decades has increased. So, despite the climate policy doom and gloom, I wasn't necessarily lying on my first slide when I said that there has been an increase. And then the bottom row shows you a little bit of the detail behind the level of detail that we're able to get with this database. So if you look at the blue section, for example, in transport, we're not just saying that a transport policy was implemented, we're able to distinguish between adoption subsidies, fuel taxes, road tolls, and other types of policies. And so now I'll move from the methods to the results. I imagine that's more interesting for this audience. But the headline is that we identified out of 1,500 climate policies in this database, 63 successful policy interventions over the time period that we analyzed. So I can't say that we were necessarily surprised, but I think it is still not necessarily a resounding successful result for us as a global community. But we were able to attribute these 63 interventions to an emission reduction of between 0.6 and 1.8 billion metric tons. And then more precisely on what types of policies we then analyzed, we were able to see that climate policies, whether they be taxation-based instruments, subsidy-based instruments, regulation or information-based, are most effective when they're combined with others. So we see that subsidies combined with regulations or with taxation tend to be much more effective than if those subsidies are implemented alone. We also see that different countries have different climate policy needs. And we also see that pricing-based instruments tend to amplify the effect size of other policy types across sectors. So pricing does sort of step forward as one of the most effective tools across the time period and the countries that we looked at. So I'll go a little bit more into detail. So this is one of our main figures from our paper, which I think it's a bit overwhelming. So I'm going to zoom in on some key results, but essentially how to interpret this chart is that each row represents the policies that we detected as being attributable to a major emission reduction in each sector. So buildings, electricity, industry, and transport. And for each policy, you'll see a darker bar and a lighter bar. The darker bar shows the average effect size, so the average emission reduction attributed to that policy if it's implemented together with others. And the lighter bar is if it's implemented alone. And so, like I said, it's a bit overwhelming. So I'll zoom in on 3 kind of key examples that show some of these headline results that we were talking about. And I'll start from the bottom and go up. So if you look at the blue row, so this is in the transport sector, we found that subsidies were particularly effective in ushering in emission reductions in transport. However, what you can see here is that they're only ever effective when they're implemented in combination with other policies. If we move one row up to the industrial sector, so the green bar, energy efficiency mandates, again, we found convincing evidence that energy efficiency mandates are critical and useful in reducing emissions in industry. But what you'll see is that black line is the average effect size of a policy mix that includes a pricing-based instrument. And so this kind of demonstrates the extent to which taxation is sort of an amplifier of the effect of other policies. And then if we move up to the yellow bar, which is in our electricity sector, you'll see the sort of demonstration of this idea that taxation-based instruments tend to be effective both alone and in mixes, and they stand out quite significantly in that frame. from these results. And the last thing that I'll show you is, just as I mentioned, what this research allows us to do is kind of create a profile per country of when and where they've reduced their emissions and what policies have succeeded in ushering in those emission reductions. And so, for example, you'll see here in Norway, in transport, we detect a significant emission reduction in 2012, and we're able to attribute that to a ban and phase out of fossil cars, increased public expenditure for rail, and some consumer adoption subsidies. And what I just want to point your attention to is that all of this data is available on our Climate Policy Explorer website, where you can zoom in on a country, on a sector, or a specific policy type to try to understand, or sort of to try to see what has worked in the world of climate policy from the perspective of what we could answer with this study. So with that, I think I'll pass it over. I hope I didn't go too much over time.
This was very insightful, so I wouldn't have blamed you if you go over time. So, but great that you also shared the resources there with us. So I can only encourage everyone to check out the link provided there. And we're gonna, of course, also continue to discuss this topic in depth now. And with this, I'm very happy to have Kaya, my co-conspirator here in the Net Zero Bodies Network, with us to guide us through the panel, and maybe quickly also introduce yourself before you kick us off, Kaya.
Hello, and thank you so much, Eva. I'd read your paper, but it's so much better hearing it from you. Before I move on to our two additional expert speakers, I was wondering if I could take Chair's prerogative and ask you one question. And feel free to say, it's too early to tell. But we at the Net Zero Policy Network are interested in, of course, in trying to advance policies in the policy mix, as that's clearly so important. But we also are specifically well positioned because we've been working on policies, kind of normative policies that define and design net zero for an organization. And we are thinking about what policies we might start with. We understand that there's a policy mix needed, but we have to start somewhere. What would you say about a strategy that, for example, helps try to align net zero government procurement with kind of corporate net zero requirements? Would that be, do you think, effective on its own, or alongside which other policies would you mix that policy or regulation with as we think through our advocacy strategy?
I think it's a great question. I think one of the interesting results that kind of came out of the research was that oftentimes it's a combination of both punishing and kind of positive incentives. And so in cases in which you're incentivizing people to take up good action, either with kind of a punishing strategy, sort of a carrot or a stick approach, combining those two things is really useful. So I think what we would probably advocate for is to find kind of the complementary carrot or the complementary stick to whatever policy that you're interested in implementing.
It's a fabulous response. Thank you. That reminds me of a paper supervised by Sam Fankhauser, which shows that governments are least likely to implement a stick. They would much prefer to put in place carrots as a policy sequencing. And so I think there's a little bit of a need, I think we see in helping correct that balance by finding where the carrots are and trying to bring in the sticks. As you said, the subsidies are much better when there's regulation. Thank you so much. We're going to come back around if we have time. But next, it is my absolute pleasure to finally introduce a colleague and co-author, Claire Wigg, who is an expert and a longtime consultant with companies now working for the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. A couple of years ago, the Exponential Roadmap Initiative reached out to Oxford Net Zero, and we had the opportunity to collaborate with Claire in some thinking about climate solutions. Claire, I was wondering if you might take the stage and tell us a little bit about why we felt the need to define what a climate solution is and how that might get introduced as a helpful definition or tool for policymakers.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to be here, Kaya. So we at Exponential Roadmap Initiative have been talking for some time about the need to scale up things in climate accountability spaces. We are always talking quite rightly about scaling down things, about reducing emissions, but we can't have a livable world which meets everyone's needs unless some products are substituted with products and services that are going to grow in scale. They're going to increase. They're going to be sold more tomorrow than today. So we started thinking about how we could define those at organizational level. At global level, we know what they are. We know that it's renewable energy. We know that it's plant-based food. We know that it's renewable fuels, etc. But what we hadn't done was work out how to get that down to organizational level. And so that's where we started thinking about what could we use to define a climate solution at that level, so that the investors, so the policymakers, so that everyone else who's perhaps a purchaser in procurement could then choose who to buy what from based on them being defined as climate solutions. So that's where the thinking originated, I would say.
Thanks so much, Claire. And I think that relates to my kind of push on government procurement. But I think we also see sectoral specific examples of where the definition of climate solutions might fit in. If you think about the carrot versus stick approach, are there specific ways or examples of climate solutions where you could see governments offering a privilege to a climate solutions company or a climate solutions product? And could you, in giving your example of a climate solutions company or product, define what we mean by that?
Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry if my internet's not so great. Yes, so we at Exponential Roadmap Initiative have been working with two companies recently, specifically on their products and solutions. One is a low carbon steel company using a completely different method to produce steel, and the other is a plant-based food company. So what we defined in our framework was that a threshold for deciding that a specific company's product or service could be considered a climate solution would be that it's by functional unit, that's by what it delivers to you and me as human beings, by functional unit, its carbon footprint is at least 50% less than the market average today. So what we're trying to do is, first of all, drive innovation so that climate solutions continue to reduce their emissions, of course, but that we define this threshold which can say that that is a climate solution and that isn't. So that in sectors we know that low carbon steel in the steel industry is what we need, but where are the specific companies delivering the specific products that will help us get there? That's what we've been trying to do. So the two examples are Stegra, which is a Swedish low carbon steel company, and Oatly, which is again a Swedish plant-based food company, which each deliver substitute products that by their carbon footprint in what they're delivering to you and me as human beings is at least 50% lower in emissions than the current market average.
Amazing. So the thinking is about singling out those companies that are going really quite far above and beyond business as usual, and figuring out how to reward them in some way by, at least as a starting place, putting a label on them. Somewhat similar to the EU taxonomy approach, but I'm gathering a bit more transformative than that.
Yeah, it's different in that the EU taxonomy approach at the moment just lists climate solution technologies and says if you're producing that climate solution type of technology, then it is a climate solution, and is subject to various privileges. But yeah, we've gone one stage further with down to the specific product and service level. And then those companies that are producing those services and products could qualify in our framework as climate solutions companies if they're doing a number of other things as well. We have a number of safeguards and guardrails around that. And at that point, they need to be in a different group of companies when it comes to accountability for their emissions than the ones who have emissions that need to be just reduced on an absolute basis.
Right. So at risk of using the word green growth, we're sort of putting them in a different category and saying your reduction pathway looks different because you're fundamentally displacing high carbon or high emitting products or services in society.
Exactly. They're the products and services that we need to allow to grow, which may, in the short term, imply absolute increases in emissions for those companies rather than decreases. And but of course, we have a huge risk over getting that wrong. So it's really important that we do our best to get it right.
Yeah, this is definitely a debate I'm watching play out in the climate governance literature right now, critiques of science-based targets, standards, and net zero standards, and thinking about how do we treat companies differently if they're taking a transformative business model approach. I think it's really tricky, and in any policy, there's going to have to be carve-outs and exceptions for companies that are doing things a bit differently. But anytime you make a carve-out or exception, of course, there's backlash from those who are not included. I want to turn now over to Alex Sexton, who has been thinking about this from the investment angle, because of course, everything you've just shared, Claire, is extremely relevant to the institutional investor environment, where we have an opportunity to drive a lot more financing for those things that might come with a green premium, at least at first. Ella, I know you've been doing amazing work around climate solutions, particularly in the energy sector, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that thinking and that work targeted for investors.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. And firstly, just want to really thank Claire as well for the work she's been doing around definitions, because that's a really kind of fundamental part of this whole process from the investor angle as well. We've got a 4-step process that we worked with investors to create for investing in climate solutions. And one of the steps is classification. And so it's really key that they have those kind of frameworks to draw on. So really, really glad to see Claire on the webinar today too. In terms of the work we've been doing in the energy sector, so maybe to put it into some broader context, one of the key ways that we've sort of equipped our investor members to address net zero is by providing them with a framework called the Net Zero Investment Framework. I won't go into too much detail on exactly all the different components of that right now, because it would probably take a whole other webinar. But one of the real key objectives that we encourage investors to consider under that framework is setting an objective for allocating to climate solutions. And the idea being that achieving goals around decarbonisation and alignment of assets with the Paris Agreement goals is really dependent on scaling up of those solutions. But for investors, those solutions tend to have a very different risk return profile to maybe some of the sort of traditional technologies that we see in those spaces. Energy being a great example. Traditional fossil fuels act in a very different way physically and as an asset to newer kind of renewable technologies. So they need to be considered differently under different investment strategies. So that's the kind of broad framing for how we approach climate solutions. And then in the energy sector, I think, we've recognized one of the key areas that requires investment is renewable energy and decarbonising the grids. And so we've been doing some work with investors over the last 6 months or so to define a methodology by which they can communicate the progress that they're making on investing in renewable energy, particularly under the COP28 tripling renewables goal that came out last year. And so we're really hoping to build some momentum behind that goal and kind of signal that really the capital is there. Investors really want to invest in this sector, not least because it's really fundamental to achieving all of the rest of their decarbonisation goals, but that some of the kind of key dependencies around grids and permitting and that sort of wider storage, transmission, distribution aspect of the value chain is really a space where actually governments can provide some really strong and helpful signals for investors that those key bits of infrastructure are going to be there. And there have been some really exciting announcements in the UK this week around new bits of research that have come out on that grids aspect. So it's a piece of work that actually we're releasing on Thursday in terms of the investor contributions to tripling renewables guidance. But yeah, really, really excited to see that come through.
Thank you so much for that. Since you mentioned it, permitting can be an issue. We have certain political conditions and policy conditions that need to change for investors to be able to unlock that capital and put it to good use. If we as a policy network were to develop a kind of briefing, say at the global level, but then that could be applied to different contexts on what a good kind of policy or grid environment looks like for investors, is that something that already exists, or is that something that would be helpful as an advocacy tool?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of what exists versus what would be helpful, I think a lot of the issues are really well known and understood by investors operating in this space. And if you ask any investor with a stake in the utilities sector, they'll probably be able to talk to you for hours about the issues with the grids and what needs to happen. But I do think that kind of coordinated engagement with policymakers is still maybe lacking a bit at the moment. And I think, one of the things that we've really been advocating for recently, particularly in the context of updated nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement that's happening this year, is for governments to set out some really clear roadmaps for specific sectors as to those how they want those investments to be phased, key bits of infrastructure that they're looking to build, and just more and more clarity around those things can really help to support investors to make those investments with confidence. But yeah, absolutely, it would be super helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that Aviva had put out some amazing work showing that nations can set out national transition plans underneath their NDCs that can really help investors invest in the country as a whole and feel more secure to make green investments. So that's absolutely worthwhile. I sort of see it as a triangle where you've got your NDC, your nationally determined contribution at the top, the sectoral roadmaps. Hopefully every country starts to have one as we move into implementation, and then your policy instruments, your kind of specific instruments that Ebba's work looked at as the kind of supporting infrastructure on the bottom. I think we're still sort of figuring out the strategy for our network and what we advocate for collectively. There's only so much organizing that you can do, but I think we are thinking that at the policy instrument level, if you had to pick a couple of policy instruments that would help investors drive more money into kind of the renewable energy transition, what would you select as a policy tool in key context, perhaps?
Yeah, I guess that's a really tricky question. I think it depends if you're looking at the global versus national context. I think the global context is really the most interesting one to me, because one thing that's, I feel like sometimes a bit of an elephant in the room when we talk about investing in the transition and in climate solutions, as opposed to on paper decarbonisation of portfolios, which is a kind of a criticism that maybe some investors have felt in the last few years. Yeah. When we talk about really investing in the transition, a lot of the investment needs are for emerging and developing economies, and actually it's super well recognised across our membership, and it's a new area of work for us in the last couple of years to really kind of make sure that our guidance and resources are suitable for those markets. But for a lot of investors, this isn't just a consideration of do they want to invest in these technologies. It's a consideration of completely new and different investment risks, different market risks that they need to consider. So I think on a global level, having real clarity around where those investment needs are is really helpful. So having joined up NDCs, as much coordination and collaboration as there can be government to government. And then on an instrument level, I think I would just really say that it's really helpful for governments to engage with the industry in their own country. It will really differ context to context in the UK, even things like planning permission and having kind of ghost projects in the queues for getting connected to the grid. Those sort of things are kind of really crucial for scaling up that investment.
Absolutely. I read an appalling statistic that in my country, the US, fingers crossed for us today, there was enough ghost permitting processes in progress to completely meet our NDC. Like, were we able to just greenlight the projects that already are ready and wanted to get on the grid, we could have met our NDC by now. So I think permitting is a huge issue, and one we'll definitely have to take a closer look at. I'm seeing a theme across all of the comments that have been made today around not just doing paper decarbonization. I think in Ebba's presentation, there's a lot of policies that have been ineffective because the right kind of incentive and enabling environment as a whole was not considered. In Claire's consideration of a net zero pathway, we don't just want to see sort of a tick box exercise on what a net zero company is. We want to see that you are in fact scaling the solutions that the world needs. And Ella, your comment just then on investors, not just claiming that they've sort of done the exercise of engaging with their portfolio, but showing where the capital expenditure is going and that the climate solutions are being scaled. It does feel like a theme across all of these three presentations, and definitely I think helps us think through our strategy, making it more complicated and harder, of course, but better as we think about our work as a network. So thank you so much for that. I have one more question for the entire panel, and then I want to turn it over to Alex to ask a final question for the entire panel, if he would like. My question for you is, what forms of collective advocacy do you think work? Do you think one company kind of at a time going to governments and saying this would be better for us works? Or do you think other models of collective action have been successful? Do you have any evidence from your work with business networks or your kind of review of policy adoption pathways or your work with investors? Do you have any examples of successful policy engagement that you might cite? Or if that is not something you want to highlight and you want to highlight something else that you didn't get to say, also feel free to dodge the question. That's a classic Oxford thing to do anyway.
I can start if you like. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just I can't tell you, I'm afraid, how effective it's been, but I was going to cite an example from Sweden. So Sweden as a country has a well-established, perhaps 10 years old now, process for this of advocacies towards the government at sectoral level. So about 10 years ago, the government got together or invited actually leading companies in about 10 sectors to sit together and make what they called their fossil-free pathway plan for Sweden, for their sector in Sweden. And then they presented them to the government. And now we're in the second iteration. So the plans were presented, government was invited to respond to what the sector leading companies in each sector wanted. And now they're in the second iteration of the plans and trying to influence policy sector by sector with the leading companies talking directly to government.
That's a fabulous example. And I wonder if even if governments don't initiate that, we could help them initiate that. And that could be a demand or a briefing in itself. Ebba or Ella, which would you like to respond to first? Go ahead.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to go. I think similarly, this is not necessarily one that's had past success, but one that we're trying to do at the moment. So I wanted to give it a shout out. But we've done a piece of work with our membership, trying to distill exactly what investors are asking governments for in the NDC 3.0 process. As part of that, we've produced a very short paper. I appreciate there's lots of papers that go around at the moment. This one really does take only about 10 minutes to read. And it's got 5 kind of key asks of government. I mentioned a couple of them already around, having specific sectoral roadmaps and working more with businesses and being kind of consistent across NDCs. But that piece we're really sort of taking to governments this year, looking to engage with them on the NDC 3.0 update process. So yeah, that's the kind of one that I guess that we're hoping will be successful this year.
Amazing. Yes, I cited that paper in our most recent briefing on what a good NDC looks like, and we'll make sure to get that out in the Policy Network newsletter. Great ask. Ebba, what about you?
Yeah, I think I don't think I'll contribute too much on the business or investor side of things, but I think one of the things that has come up very frequently in kind of reporting the research that I was just talking about was in kind of the public acceptability of all of these strategies. So the idea is sort of that, we might both enact policies or like enact system-wide change, but that needs to be something that people then won't backlash against. And, whether that backlash is informed by misinformation or sort of actual like lived experience is a different question. But the fact that sort of the public as a collective organizing group, either against or for progress is something that is a really complicated question, but I think ideally shouldn't be left out of the discussion.
Did you see any trends in public backlash? Are there certain policies that draw more ire than others?
Taxation, for sure. I think I communicated quite a lot to both the Canadian government and the French and the Swedish government and the media around this paper. And one of the main questions was, oh, great, taxation is a useful instrument, but our public doesn't want it. Yeah. I know Sweden is a surprising one in that, but they've only recently kind of reversed on dual decades long acceptance of carbon taxes. So it's a hot topic and was one of the main kind of pragmatic critiques of what we did.
Yeah, that I was going to raise that during your presentation. I, as a political scientist and someone who's worked for a carbon pricing campaign in the past, the political economy hurdles are huge. Often something that's worth it is not easy. But if suppose that only speaks to the need to diversify and work towards policy mixes rather than a single bullet approach. And and hopefully taxation with subsidies and dividends, positive kind of carrots, as you say, could be better welcomed.
For sure.
Well, I've overstayed my welcome on this panel chairing shift, so I'm going to pass over to Alex to bring back the order and perhaps ask a final question of our panel. But thank you so much, all three of you, doing such great work with businesses, investors, and policy research. Really appreciate it. I think Alex might be having some trouble with his internet at the moment. Just while he's doing that, I'm going to speak to sort of the next part of our 20 minutes we have all together here, and talk a little bit about what we're trying to do with the policy network. And maybe our panelists can give some feedback, as well as we can get some feedback in the chat. So one of the things that we are hoping to advance as a part of this network is a sort of a collective effort on what good looks like, right? So we have a sense of what effective looks like from EBA. We have a sense of what investors need from Ella, and we have a sense of what companies good looks like if you're trying to drive a climate solution. But what specific policy instruments or policy mixes, with EBA's research in mind, could we be pushing for as a network? And I see, thankfully, we have Alex here to save me. Alex, I know we have some slides to talk through our plans for the policy network. We're still developing the strategy on that. Are we able to share those so we can get feedback from everyone in our last 20 minutes here?
We are indeed. Sorry for that. I dropped for a quick moment.
Perfect timing.
I want to thank you also from my side quickly again, the panel, excellent discussion. We would have loved to go into more audience Q&A. I see there's one question in the chat that we will tackle, but maybe we take it after the call or just in writing. So I would suggest, thanks Kaya, to move on and to share a bit what the network has been up to so far. And apologies if I missed what you already said. Shall we start from here, Kaya?
Yeah, let's start from here. Do you want to go over this slide?
Let me kick us off, and then you can take the next one.
Sounds good.
Just because I would assume that many of you are still fairly new to our network. So quickly, just as an intro and recap, as we are approaching the last few weeks of the year, the network has been launched pretty much early in this year. Let's say we since then have held 3 webinars focused on different areas of policy. Climate policy. We had 3 newsletters, which I hope you all subscribe to and thus also receive. And by now we're very happy to have more than 500 members from various backgrounds. And this is always great to see. That's why I ask at the beginning for everyone to share a bit their background, where they come from, and the organizations. So you really see the mix we are aspiring to, as to we have NGOs, we have businesses, we have policymakers, researchers here, exactly those audience members we want to bring to the table here. So that is a bit of a recap. Kaya, do you want to look ahead for us?
Look ahead. So we've been putting our heads together because we've been building organically, steadily, slowly, and we haven't put you all to work yet, but it is our intention with a Doers Club to do exactly that. So acknowledging that we have businesses, policy makers, NGOs, and investors in our network, we thought it would be really exciting to bring everyone together quarterly for a kind of what I'm calling an assembly. Others can call it a community meeting, or rather an accountability check-in to say, what have we done? In the meantime, we're going to be kind of captaining a business group and a policy group through various partnerships to be driving some active engagement on with governments on some of our key policy priorities that we identify together. So what this will look like is that a core group of us who sign up from the business community or the policy community will work together on a briefing and actually use it to engage governments. This is an exciting but important experiment, perhaps not so experimental for those of us who have spent a lot of time doing policy advocacy in the past. For others of us who are very new to it, it will be kind of scary. And that's why a peer network is so important. And so as part of those smaller groups, we'll feedback to each other on progress, experiment on what is working and think about how this fits into overall government frameworks like the sectoral strategies that we were talking about. That will be a smaller, closer knit group that is really, really active. And so if you sign up to that group, we expect you to be doing work, hence it being called a Doers Club. But we'll also have quarterly check-ins with the whole network where we report back. And this will be an opportunity for people who are in sort of any of the other groups to interface and hear what others are doing. We will also continue to have quarterly newsletters that go out and quarterly webinars like this one, where we're doing more of a broadcast. We definitely heard from feedback from a previous poll that people in this network want to stay involved in a passive way to keep informed about the latest trends and research in the policy landscape, in the net zero policy landscape, and we will still absolutely be doing that. But we also want to put a smaller, dedicated group of you to work with the right informed resources and experimenting with the action that we need to drive the change that we want to see. So if we could go to the next slide. We will be developing policy briefings. I've mentioned them kind of to drop little seeds of thought throughout the panel today. This is just an example of a policy briefing that I want to write on what good net zero government procurement looks like. It's something that our research, initial research and data gathering from the Policy Monitor shows is ill-defined, and something that could have, based on the kind of 17% of GDP globally that governments are responsible for and spending, a huge impact. And so that's something that I'm dedicated to building and hoping that we can mobilize people around. We will be working with leading NGOs that are already doing advocacy work in this space. We'll be working with net zero aligned companies to get their feedback on what good policy looks like, so it's not coming out of the ether. And we'll be hoping to run these briefs by top tier policymakers. As a result, these briefs will exist as an open source resource on our platform, the beautiful netzeropolicy.net website, which I hope and suspect you've all visited, thanks to the Normative team's work about a year ago on that. And we're hoping that these briefings can turn the groundswell of voluntary action on net zero into a set of clear, fair, and aligned common ground rules for the net zero economy. That's kind of our mission and our vision statement. If you could go to the next slide. Of course, these kind of policy briefings and our continued webinars and broadcasts will be informed by ongoing tracking and progress. Every good kind of transnational initiative requires accountability and kind of the research to look back and say, are we achieving what we set out to achieve? This will be informed through the Blavatnik School of Government's Net Zero Policy Monitor, but also research from partner universities and partner researchers like the ones that you saw today. And then Alex, I'm going to ask you to take over from here, just because I need to plug in my computer.
This is very, very exciting announcements here that you just heard, and I want to also point your attention in the meantime, so I'm going to narrate through the next slide in a second. But we have a poll that's just been pulled up, so please start to submit your votes while we keep kind of the updates coming for you. The poll, you find it again in the top, bottom right corner, and the poll is around what policy briefings you would find most useful for yourself. So you already heard Kaya announcing that we want to work on these policy briefs, but we of course want to make sure that whatever we are putting out there for you guys is actually useful, is actually the one that you want to be working on. So please submit your response to the poll, and we can look at the results in a second. So Kaya already painted the vision there, or the structure, and while this sounded a bit like, we had the business group, we had the policy group, we have the NGO group, please don't get us wrong. This is not at all meant to, again, go back into silos. It's quite the opposite. It's acknowledging that each of these groups has a dedicated need, has a dedicated, oftentimes even language that they speak and that they understand best. And of course, also some of them have existing networks, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. That's the worst thing. We can't compete to save the planet, so to speak. We have to build on existing networks. So that's why some of these groups are already tapping into and combining existing networks, and others we try to newly assemble from our membership, from our audience. And at the end of the year, so we're aspiring to the end of next year, which is then 2025, we're also going to have case studies that hopefully provide a blueprint demonstrating the best of networks work in action. So for the business group, for example, we're going to then see how does policy engagement work best based on a few case studies. So Kaya mentioned a brief, for example, on procurement, and then we want to gather the experiences there, like what works in policy advocacy on this procurement side. It's already pointed out here, so that will be actually the procurement example will be one of the first ones we do want to tackle. And then same for the policy group, NGO group, and investor group. And it's very important, once more, we're going to facilitate dialogue between those groups. Those are not separate, but we want to have the kind of each group's need met, and then bring it together to jointly work on how can we move the needle together, just as we saw or heard today on the panel. Kaya, anything to add from your side for this slide?
No, that's really a great point, and that's why we want to have the kind of network meetings all together for cross-pollination of those groups. We'll also hopefully by the end of the year be building together case studies as to what has worked, so that we can highlight the best work across the network.
Perfect. Then I would say we have a quick look at the poll results, because I now see we have quite some votes in. So just as a kind of summary from my side, without going into too much detail, we see mandatory transition plans. Those are being ranked most highly by you guys from the audience. We are 24% curious to, or actually wanting to engage with those policy briefs. And then we have carbon market regulation. Yeah, also something that Kaya is very much familiar with. So that's also topic. And disclosure. Obviously, I guess most top of mind. Well, disclosure, very closely followed by procurement and subsidies. Very much top of mind for many, especially businesses right now out there. How can we align disclosures more effectively, efficiently, and also how can we maybe lower the cost, the resource burden that they often take on companies.
Amazing.
I know that we have one more poll. Let me quickly
Let's do it.
And we can bring that up while we are wrapping up the core content. Let's see if we can get that last poll launched. And yeah, so while we get that up for you guys to also share your feedback on that one, it's pretty much, I mean, there was pretty much the overview that we had in mind to share with you as to what's to come. Maybe actually we're gonna quickly end on this slide again, because I do think it's a nice representation of what the future holds for all of us. We have the chat open, so if there are any more thoughts or feedback, of course, do let us know, and we will start to assemble the structure that you see here on the screen with these different groups, and really want to have this call to action, which I was just glancing over. So this will be joint network, obviously, but it would in particular be then we want you to think about and get ready for engaging in these dedicated groups. Kaya mentioned it is work. This is not to be scary, but it is a serious thing that we want to engage with. This should be people who really want to move the needle forward. So rather have a small dedicated group of people who are doers, than a large consortium with is not kind of functional. But of course, the outcomes will be shared with everyone, because we need everyone here, everyone in the network, ultimately to take combined and joint action. Kaya, anything from your side?
Exactly right. Yeah, so we're still thinking through how we recruit into our smaller groups, but please do reach out if you're like, I absolutely want to share my wisdom and expertise with that smaller group and do some work. We will also be really actively recruiting members of companies and policymakers through interviews and systematic outreach into those groups. So we've been building this network pretty organically up until now. If you have recommendations of people who you think could be really great experts for the working groups, please also feel free to recommend peers to come work with us. Again, this is, a voluntary network. We're building this across institutions. A lot of the change we need to see is going to be through multilateral partnerships like this one, where people experiment to make a change, and we're really open to feedback as a result of that. I think that's largely everything, and I think people like us better when we leave them 5 minutes to get on to their next call. I want to thank again our incredible panel for sharing their insights, which I think is at the core of our network today. And also to thank Alex and the organizing team, Matilda and Rosalind, and Jessica and everyone who's just been really deeply involved throughout this process. Thank you so much.
100%. Also in the background, you don't see it, but Michelle is very active in steering all the old tech in the background. And there's going to be a poll coming up for the webinar feedback in general. So please stick around for just a few more seconds. And don't forget to join the network. We will have the full write-up of our new 2025 strategy for you to come very soon. So keep your inbox open, but you don't get it if you don't sign up. So please sign up first. Otherwise, you will miss out on opportunities to engage and to actively shape the future of net zero policy, which we desperately need. So once more, thanks everyone. Thanks, Kaya. And
thank you. Thank you, panelists. Bye-bye.